Hello, we're joined today by Mary Robinson, lawyer, a politician, diplomat, the first woman to serve as president of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, subsequently United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, more recently UN Special Envoy on Climate Change, a woman I've long admired for her service on critical issues and causes affecting humanity. Madam President, thank you so much for joining us today here at IMD.
It's a pleasure, David. And from now on, you can call me Mary.
Wonderful. I love that. One of the issues that you've been spending a lot of time on recently is the issue of climate justice. You've written a book on the subject. In the book, you speak about the effect that holding your first grandchild had on you and thinking about the intersection of justice and climate change. What is climate justice?
I think it's really important that we ground ourselves in the injustices, because the climate problem is human-made, human-induced. It's not an accident. It's not phenomenal. It's not nature. It's our doing, the rich world. And therefore, there are levels of injustice. And I actually could speak for a long time about it, but I've kind of identified 5 layers, and I'll give you very briefly. Firstly, that it affects disproportionately the poorest countries, poorest communities, small island states, indigenous peoples, who are least responsible. And they also happen to be the black and brown and indigenous peoples in our world. So it's also a racial injustice in a sense. Secondly, within that, the gender injustice, that women have different social roles, less power, often less land rights even, less access to credit and so on. They have to make their communities resilient, but they don't get to the table to get, access. Thirdly, the intergenerational injustice that young climate activists have told us about, and that's very real, because we're not doing enough now. They will have to do more in their time, and they know it. We're loading them with an injustice. Fourthly, and this is more subtle, the different pathways to development. Developed countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel. Our job is to wean ourselves off with just transition for the workers in coal and oil and gas, and in my country in particular in peat, in turf. And developing countries need to develop. They're finding oil and gas, particularly Africa, and they have 600 million people with no access to electricity, and they're caught in a bind. If we don't provide the clean energy, they'll go the other route, and who can blame them? So the 5th injustice is the injustice to nature herself, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species, all these reports we're hearing, the overfishing, all of that.
Through your work, you have spoken with a lot of people in some of these countries that you mentioned, in developing countries, in the communities that are already bearing the brunt of the climate change that is real. Very often people who didn't contribute, neither they nor their ancestors, to the problem that we're facing. What have these conversations been like? What did you learn from them?
Actually, they energize me, to be honest. The most recent example I've had is I was recently in Uganda, deliberately, before preparing for COP27 as chair of the elders. And first of all, I went with Vanessa Nakate, who's a very good young climate science activist. She's actually brilliant. And she has a project with her partner of bringing solar energy to schools and also helping cook stove things. So we had 5 children. The school actually was on holiday, but these 5 kids in their uniform came along specially, and they were great fun. And they brought us first to the kitchen to show us the cook stoves, and then they showed us the light, and then we had a conversation. And they were so alert and so aware, and I come back from these visits full of energy.
You mentioned that one of the injustices, of course, is the fact that wealthy countries developed by burning fossil fuels really contributing overwhelmingly.
And we have to honor the workers in coal and oil and gas for that reason.
Right. So we'll come back to the just transition in particular, but you focused on the need for for people in developing countries to have access to electricity, to energy. And so you've advocated recently for example, the exploitation of gas reserves in Africa. I mean, this must be difficult, sort of balancing these various objectives.
Actually, I'm very modest in my thinking about that.
Okay.
I've listened a lot to my African sisters in particular, because I'm part of a women leaders network of the Africa Europe Foundation.
Yeah.
And we've discussed this a lot, and I really have listened. And there are, more than 600 million people in Africa who never switch the switch for electricity, and 900 million who cook on dirty cooking, the sense of, biomass, it's charcoal, etc. So there is a problem. I don't think we should open up to new oil infrastructure, because that's actually not in Africa's interests.
Yeah.
The International Energy Agency, a conservative enough body, has told us no. Guterres in the UN has told us no. The elders believe no to new infrastructure.
Yeah.
But we need to find ways of helping radically to accelerate that access to energy. And it has to be hopefully clean energy of that vast number of people. I mean, it's shocking when you look at Europe and Africa and compare them. I mean, I've learned a lot from this relationship.
So talk a little bit then about what that looks like in practice. Is that subsidies from wealthier countries to poorer countries? Is this tech transfer? What is the role of business play in this? If you could just expand on what that looks like.
I suppose it's a range of things. One of the things that came out of COP26 was the project for South Africa, 8.5 million, to help South Africa get out of coal and into clean energy. Yeah. And the elders were in South Africa. We had a very good meeting with Ramaphosa, and it's not going as well as it should because not enough of the support is in grant form. It's in loans. And of course, this is a problem even for South Africa. So, there's always a kind of lesson to be learned when you're on the ground and hear the different perspectives. And we need projects like that for Vietnam, for Indonesia, for India maybe, to help countries to leapfrog into clean energy. But we also need more attention to the off-grid, to the clean cooking solutions. Clean cooking is not just a women's issue, it's a household issue. I mean, it would make such a difference if women have access to, for example, electric stoves. I remember the rural, I don't remember in the sense I'm still too young to actually, but I remember my father talking about when rural electrification came in Ireland. He was a medical doctor, and he said it transformed the rural Ireland that he was practicing in as a doctor. That difference. Why in the 21st century have we still got people who haven't got that rural electrification? That should be a priority.
It's so interesting, right? So here we spend a lot of time with business executives and MBA students, and so frequently there's still this sense that this energy transition, this decarbonization, is about sacrifice, it's about cost. And just listening to you, this is just a tremendous opportunity to do right by hundreds of millions of people, elevate their standard of living, and in the process create flourishing ventures.
Absolutely, and in fact, I'm involved with a number of women leaders now, and we are adopting a very positive narrative. Yeah. We're actually asking the question, what if our best future is still ahead of us?
Yeah.
And it is. Our best future is still ahead of us. It's a clean energy world. Think of the cities. They will be green. They'll have gardens, they'll have farms. Buildings will provide the energy. Think of the rural areas where we'll have conservation agriculture. We'll have rural rewilding, restoration. Think of oceans. We'll stop the thing. But we also face a worse world. And I think it's better for people to know we have a choice. We have a choice between that best world we have to hurry to or our worst world, which is where we're heading. Every report now is very grim because we're heading in the wrong direction, but we can change.
I like that sort of positive narrative. That's what it should be. I think one of the things that young climate activists have done simultaneously is focus attention on the intergenerational injustice, as you mentioned it, and they've tried to get us excited about what that future could look like.
I think we actually have to keep reminding ourselves and imagining and telling ourselves what this future is going to be.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, we won't have the energy to have what I call a sort of moonshot approach now, a moonshot mentality. A moonshot is very much in play at the moment. I mean, President Biden is using it for his cancer issue, and fair enough. But actually, we need it more in the climate than any other, because next January will be 7 years from 2030. The scientists have told us unequivocally we have to more or less halve global emissions by 2030, and yet they're more or less going up. Although I note that China, and I mention that when I'm speaking, is coming down slightly just at the moment. So we can get there. It's going to take a huge effort, and it's going to take a human rights effort, because a lot of the earth minerals that we need are in Africa. And we have to have responsible business that respects local communities, respects human rights. I'm writing a lot about that now.
Time horizons are, of course, a major challenge. One of the biggest impediments, it seems, to more ambitious, more directive action to address the climate emergency is that the perception of costs is now and the benefits are in the future. And of course, most heads of government don't serve longer than 5 or 6 years, perhaps. The average tenure for a CEO is even shorter than that. How do we help mobilize action now by leaders whose time horizon in office, for example, is so much smaller than the scale of the problem?
It's interesting, I was very worried about this terrible war of aggression on Ukraine by the Russian Federation, because it immediately meant we can't have Russian gas. Where do we buy gas in Africa and elsewhere? How do we, and it seemed a moment of resurgence of fossil fuel, but now it's becoming a moment where Europe is realizing, the opportunity to actually accelerate getting out of fossil fuel. And I think that's beginning to happen. And I'm involved with a number of business leaders, the B team of business leaders, in a summit, a virtual summit in October, precisely on how Europe can accelerate out of. And I think that's what we need, to be jolted into, it's not business as usual for anyone, as your very good graduates will know.
No, you're absolutely right. I was speaking to a colleague the other day who just renovated a house, and here in Switzerland, they put geothermal energy in their home with solar panels on the roof to power the pumps. And you look at this and you say, if all of Switzerland, all of Germany had this, how would the geopolitical context be different? We wouldn't even be worried about.
And wind energy,
right.
Which is something my country, with the Atlantic and the offshore potential, and Denmark has shown the way.
Yeah. So the technologies are here, which in some ways makes it even more frustrating that we're not accelerating their deployment. So you said we're heading in the wrong direction still. And of course, even if we now get more dramatic changes, bigger investments, there will still likely be hundreds of millions, if not more, who could be displaced by the middle of this century as a result of climate change, because the part of the world that they live in will either be underwater or they'll be barren. How should we think about refugees, climate refugees in this context? And what is the imperative, again, for government and for business?
It's a difficult time. It's clear that the scientists themselves are quite shocked at how quickly things are happening. And they're much worse than they were predicting. Look at that flooding in Pakistan, over a third of the country, with over 1,000 people killed and so many millions, 30 million displaced, crops destroyed, all of that without Pakistan having contributed to the problem. We're going to see much more of the justice issue arising. I think it will happen in COP27 when in Egypt in November. There's going to be a reckoning. The rich world really has to get real on this. I mean, I really mean that. Get real on doubling, as we promised in Glasgow, to double climate adaptation finance by 2025. There's no real pathway for that at the moment. We spend more on emissions globally than we do on adaptation. But adaptation has now become very serious. And then beyond adaptation, you have loss and damage, where you can't adapt to destruction. You've got to have compensation for that. And we've got to get real about that, or we will have a very troubled world, I believe.
And do you think we can get governments to not only honor those commitments, but also open themselves up, prepare societies for the fact that we will have climate refugees, and particularly those of us in rich countries who disproportionately contribute to the problem will have a responsibility to open our homes, to open our countries.
Yeah. I think it is time to prepare. In a way, for Europe, the way we've responded to Ukraine is a good lesson.
Yeah.
People have had to leave Ukraine because of the terrible, aggressive invasion and the destruction and the deaths, etc. And people understand that. We need to understand it also in a climate sense. We need to have an empathy about it, because you're right. It's already happening. Look at the Horn of Africa. It is suffering incredibly at the moment through severe drought. Again, not caused, but aggravated by the climate issue. It's not a total reason, but we no longer say it's not a reason.
Yes.
We're actually beginning to allocate. They can actually allocate for Pakistan what the contribution of climate was to that worse flooding. And it's happening all over. It's happening in California. It's happening in China. Terrible drought in China at the moment. So I think the world has to have a wake-up moment of responsibility now. It's not a guilt trip. It's not making accusations to people. It's saying we have to manage this, manage it well, because our best world is still in front of us. We can get there.
You've been so active for so long in international institutions, the United Nations, but of course also you've played a leading role in the Elders, the Club of Madrid, the B Team, a number of non-governmental organizations and networks. Do we have the right institutions to catalyze the necessary actions?
I think our world is pretty fragmented at the moment, which is worrying. There have been shifts, and the war in Ukraine obviously hasn't helped. And there's a certain divide that wasn't there when I served as High Commissioner for Human Rights, for example. We were more together as a world, and this worries the elders, obviously. But I think that the broad civil society can come together in a new way. I think this is already happening. I think women leaders and the B Team of business leaders, and We Mean Business, and a whole lot of other business leaders have the same intent of ensuring that we can make sure we have that best world ahead of us. And young climate activists, indigenous communities, I think there's less of a divide. I think there's more of an awareness, because of the urgency of now. We have to come together in a broader creative movement, which includes, of course, governments and the UN and the EU and all the rest of it, but which has to be actually almost pushed by the wider forces of this movement. I'm very keen on that, working, night and day now with women leaders, networks and networks of women leaders, to keep pushing.
So you mentioned women leaders just now. Previously, you spoke about sisters. Your sisters with whom you're waging this campaign. Talk a little bit about the role of women leaders in particular in this important work at the nexus of climate and justice.
I think there is a trust which is very valuable. It's almost as if we don't even have to discuss it. When we're together, and I say this as a co-chair with Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf of this network of African and European women, we don't even have to discuss. We have to just problem solve. How do we move forward in a problem-solving way? And that's, I think, instinctively what women try to do. Less hierarchical, far more interested in how we get the solutions. And I think the world needs that.
And this is the sort of pragmatic problem-solving approach. Let's check egos at the door and just get down to business. But you've also made some references about the specific impact that the changes have on women in developing countries. What are some of the challenges that are perhaps unique to women as they're confronting this world of climate change?
That's the gender injustice. It's very real. Women are far more impacted because they don't have power, they're not at the table, they're not decision-making, they don't have rights. Take a terrible flood. Women wear long skirts, they hold their children, and they die in much greater numbers than men. They can't climb trees as easily, etc., to escape a flood or a fire, that's one manifestation. But much more deeply, women are poorer. Women, all of the statistics show, any crisis drives girls into early child marriage, out of school. So the gender injustice is a very real, but women at the same time are agents of change. And this is something I've witnessed over and over again. As I did recently in Uganda, I could tell you about lots of projects that I saw there, where women were leading their communities and helping even refugee communities into Uganda from the DRC, in one case with technology, with their small business. They don't get the money. The climate finance doesn't get down to, I'm very interested now, as part of women leaders stepping up, that we get more money to resilience building at local level, which is very often women leaders.
So one of the exercises that we sometimes do with leaders when they come here to campus to get them to think of new ways to solve problems is we do what we call a future back. Rather than saying, how could we do this? We say, we did it. How did we do it? And it changes the conversation. So if you think ahead and you say, we did it, and doing it may still mean an increase, obviously, in the temperature, but we're averting the worst, perhaps keeping it below 2%. How did we do it? What role did technology play? What role did appropriate use of capital play? What role did leadership play in getting us to a sustainable climate by the middle of the century?
I think leadership plays the main role, more than 50%, maybe 60%, 70% leadership. I think it's really important we have innovation. I've learned about innovation, for example, in carbon capture. Carbon capture is not going to solve the problem. In fact, a lot of it is not as credible as it's said to be. But there are new nature-based and even carbon capture that's encouraging companies to engage in how they capture carbon and then buying the carbon from them.
Yeah.
I'm all in favor of innovation.
Yeah.
I think we need solutions-based, forward-looking approaches. And that's where the women leaders want to link with young climate activists, with indigenous communities, with faith-based communities, with the progressive business community in driving a connection of the positives and also getting more funding, as I said, to what's happening, what's really making a difference in communities on the ground. And the money's not filtering down. So if you ask me, I would say if we can succeed in this kind of broader movement with a positive narrative, solutions-oriented, together far more, binding in the wider civil society around governments and the UN, etc., we will get there.
50% is going to be leadership, you said, or even more than 50%. You've spoken about many of the inspiring leaders you've met through your work. Who are some of the leaders in governments, perhaps, that you think are setting the right tone, that have the right urgency? And then in a moment, I might ask you the same about business leaders.
I'm very impressed by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. Mm-hmm. She has spoken very eloquently and very innovatively. And she and Janet, what's her name, with the Treasury in the United States?
Janet Yellen.
Yellen are, almost together in thinking of new ways. Kristalina Georgieva, head of the International Monetary Fund. These are leaders that are, thinking. And obviously Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. There are a significant number, and I think once women get into positions, they tend to link with each other in a way that is quite creative as well.
Are there business leaders that you work with? I know you work with a lot of them in the B team, I suppose.
The B team has a number of very progressive women leaders.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And they're similarly having this impact. And some men as well that you look at and you say they're setting the right tone, they have the right urgency.
Absolutely. And actually, what's remarkable about the B team is the fact that Sharon Burrow, who's a remarkable woman, leader of the International Congress of Trade Unions, Secretary General of it, she is the deputy of the B team. And she is there with a very clear worker facing reality, but engaging very positively with Paul Polman, with others, with the head of IKEA, with others. It's a remarkable dialogue that goes on in the B team, because it also recognizes, and I'm glad to see, for example, that in the United States, the trade union movement is coming up.
Yeah.
I think this is what we need. We need a fairer world. I'm personally quite a fan of the donut economics, which I'm sure your MBA students know far more about than I do.
But say a little bit about it.
Well, no, it's just we need to recognize that central to our economic theory has to be, the good of the whole.
Yes.
And I think that's really brought out in the donut economics.
Yeah. And you mentioned before the importance of recognizing the livelihoods that depend on, for example, fossil fuel production still in part of the world. So say a little bit, if you would, about just transition also in developed countries, because these implications are real for folks who work in coal mining, who might still be in the oil and gas industry.
The first thing is we need to think in two ways. We need at the same time to think of a just transition out of fossil fuel and a just transition into clean energy. Yeah. And it involves the same communities often. So out of fossil fuel means retraining, etc., but it also means new green jobs, new investment. Let me give you the small example in Ireland, my own country, where because we're now no longer, our Board Namona, our state board, is no longer functioning, 400 people lost quite good jobs in the Midlands of Ireland. So what to do? And we really have thought about it a lot. And we've had a whole just transition policy, and it meant putting money into the Midlands, into opportunities for green jobs, rewilding of the bog, which is also important as a climate sink, etc. Using nature-based to also have a tourism potential. It's a concerted effort. I'm sure people would like more, but actually it's what should be done all over the world now. A real attempt. It breaks my heart to see what's happening in the United States with coal companies closing and the workers just being pretty well just let go. Yeah. I mean, it's quite shocking.
And of course, it will make the transition that we need and the investments that are required and the policies that need to change, it will make that unsustainable politically if we're creating millions of losers in the process.
Yeah, it slows the whole process if you don't bring people with you, communities with you. And, I think it's really important that, as I say, we begin by valuing those who helped us build our economies. Yeah. Because they deserve to be valued, and then move into a discussion. But for reasons that are very clear, we can't continue with fossil fuel. We've got to move as rapidly as possible out of fossil fuel.
Yeah. No, this is, of course...
And of course, we have, unfortunately, a lot of misinformation and lobbying against that. A lot of it by oil and gas companies, I'm sorry to say. They are the tobacco companies of now. The money that is spent is incredible on a kind of propaganda, even a propaganda about what they're doing on green energy, a lot of them. Some of them are beginning to really move, but not enough.
So I'm sensing that you're concerned about what has been called greenwashing, companies represented.
Very concerned.
What can we do about that? Is that
make it more transparent, call it out. Make it more transparent all the time. And that is happening. There's a lot of work on just exposing. Yeah. I mentioned some of this, in my talk this evening.
Yeah, wonderful. In closing, what is your message to those leaders in business in particular who may still think, well, either the problem isn't as urgent or they're not in a position to contribute to the solution, somebody else will take care of it? What do you say to those folks?
I would say the reality is you need to step up, not once or twice, 10 times. Step up 10 times in the intensity of addressing the climate crisis. Make it personal in your life. know that you're making it personal by changing some of your habits. We can all do that. Be more efficient with energy, change our eating habits even, all kinds of things, our transport, etc. Secondly, get angry about those who aren't doing enough. And thirdly, most importantly, keep imagining this world we're hurrying towards, because that's what motivates us.
Mary Robinson, thank you so much for taking the time and speaking with me today.
Okay.